Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Helix Varda Station did not appear on anyone's list of dream postings. It appeared with some regularity on lists of stations that had the most stable crew retention in the Mid-Belt corridor, which sounds like a compliment until you understand that the reason people stayed was not enthusiasm, but rather a specific kind of gravitational inertia. The same force that keeps objects in orbit not because they are passionate about orbiting, but because stopping requires more energy than continuing. The station drifted in a slow, considered arc between the Venn system and the outer research clusters, close enough to both to be administratively convenient and far enough from either to feel, on certain long shifts, like a parenthesis someone had inserted into the sentence of the known universe and then forgotten to close. Eli Voss had arrived 2 years ago with a duffel bag, a calibrated skepticism about orbital assignments, and the reasonable expectation that he would stay 8 months, collect the posting credit, and transfer somewhere with a better cafeteria. The cafeteria had not improved. He was still here. He had stopped examining why with the same diligence he'd once applied to the question, which he recognized as either personal growth or defeat, depending on which hour of the shift he asked himself. He was, by most metrics that mattered, good at his work. He was a medical technician with a specialty in cross-species recovery protocols, which on a station with 3 permanent alien staff populations and a rotating roster of researchers from 6 others, meant that his particular skill set was the kind that got quietly relied upon by everyone and formally credited by almost no one. He knew which of the senior physicians preferred silence during rounds. He knew which diagnostic panels on the second-generation med frames ran cold by a consistent margin of 0.3 degrees and needed manual adjustment, a fact he had reported twice and compensated for daily ever since, because the universe rewards flexibility over justice. He knew where the good coffee was, not the cafeteria coffee, which had been described in crew surveys as ambitious, and in private conversation as something considerably more specific, but the single functioning premium dispenser tucked behind a storage panel in the equipment corridor on level 4, which Eli had found by accident and visited with the quiet devotion of a man who had made peace with small mercies. Essira knew about the coffee too. This was not a coincidence exactly. He had shown her the panel 8 months ago, on a slow Thursday, because she had been holding a cup of the cafeteria's output with the expression of someone who had expected better from a civilization capable of interstellar travel, and he had found this expression so precisely correct that showing her felt like the only reasonable response. She had looked at the dispenser, then at him, then back at the dispenser, and said something in Vaethari that his translation implant rendered as either "this changes things significantly," or "this is a meaningful gesture," the implant being confident on the sentiment and agnostic on the phrasing. He had not asked for clarification. He still hadn't. She worked in the xenobiology-adjacent research wing, a name that sounded like it was trying to avoid committing to a definition, which was accurate, because the wing handled everything that fell between established species-specific medicine and the genuinely uncharted territory of bodies that had not yet been fully catalogued. She was Vaethari, which meant that at first glance she read as almost human, the kind of almost that was worse in certain ways than obvious difference, because the brain kept reaching for familiar categories and finding them gently, persistently wrong. Her face was structured on lines a human could navigate: 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth that arranged itself into expressions requiring no translation guide. She stood in human height range. She carried herself with the particular composure of someone who had learned to move through spaces designed for a different species without making it anyone else's problem. But the details accumulated. Her skin held a faint iridescence that shifted with the light, as though something beneath the surface was conducting a separate, quieter conversation with the photons in the room. Along her temples, her collarbones, and the backs of her hands ran bioluminescent traceries, fine lines, precisely branched, that pulsed and shifted through colors in response to her emotional state with a candor that her expression rarely matched. Her eyes were dark and large, with a ring of amber around the iris that caught light independently of whatever the room was doing. Her hair was black and straight and fell past her shoulders, and at the ends, if the light hit correctly, it carried a faint luminescence that Eli had noticed on the third day they had worked together and had been carefully not thinking about ever since, with the limited success that careful not thinking generally produces. They had been on the same shift rotation for 14 months. They ate lunch together on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and gradually, without a meeting being held about it, Wednesdays. Eli had read 2 academic papers on Vaethari bioluminescent emotional display markers, which he had found in the station's research archive at 11 o'clock on a night when he had no professional reason to be reading xenobiology literature, and which he had not mentioned to anyone, including himself, more than strictly necessary. It was a Thursday when his shoulder finally ran out of patience. The shoulder had been sending warnings for approximately 3 years. Eli, who was professionally trained to interpret physiological signals and personally committed to ignoring his own, had classified these warnings in ascending order of urgency. First as occasional discomfort, then as persistent discomfort, then as discomfort with ambition, and finally, after a particular incident involving a supply crate on level 2, and a sound that made 2 passing HFY researchers stop and look at him with what he could only describe as biological concern, as a situation requiring attention. Dr. Yenna, the station's chief physician, had used the phrase, "You will genuinely regret this," during his assessment with the specific cadence of someone who had said it before, and intended to be documented as having said it. And Eli had looked at the imaging results and concluded, with the reluctant honesty of a man meeting an argument he cannot beat, that she was correct. The procedure itself was minor. This was the word everyone used, and they used it with the reassuring frequency of people who understood that the word minor was doing significant psychological work. Minor surgery. Minor sedation window. Minor recovery period. The sedation required was standard issue for cartilage work on human patients, deep enough to keep him cooperative and absent for the duration, light enough that the come-up would be gradual rather than sudden, his awareness returning in slow increments like a transmission resolving through interference. He would be in the recovery ward for 4 to 6 hours. He would be groggy. He might be briefly confused, as anesthesia and full cognitive function negotiated their handover in the unhurried way of shift changes on a station where no one was in a particular rush. He would be, for the duration, entirely unconscious, and his unconscious self would be left in charge of the body, with the understanding that it had very little to do and would do very little. He did not know that S0 would stop by. There was no reason he would know this, because she had not planned it with enough intention to tell anyone, including herself. She had a meeting in the medical wing that afternoon, a protocol review for the cross-species inflammatory response study she had been running with Dr. Orvith for the better part of 6 months. The meeting ended at 14:20. The recovery ward was on the same level, at the corridor's other end. She had told herself she would look in briefly, the way colleagues did, the way anyone would, and that briefly was a word she had also not examined with appropriate rigor before deploying it. The ward was quiet in the particular way of medical spaces that are functioning as intended. 2 other patients occupied beds on the far side of the room, both asleep. Eli was in the 3rd bay, near the window that looked out onto the station's outer hull, and beyond it, the dark and the distant light of the Venn system's secondary star. He looked, Essira thought, entirely unlike a person. He looked like a person's best approximation of being absent, the breathing slow and absolute, the face slack in the way that faces only go when the consciousness behind them has genuinely left the building, rather than merely retreated to a back room. The monitoring equipment beside him reported everything it should. The station hummed its frequency, which she had stopped noticing in her first month and which she heard now briefly, before stopping noticing it again. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Just for a few minutes, she told herself, which was the same lie the chair had been telling visitors since the ward was commissioned. The attending nurse, a HFY named Pell with the efficient manner of someone who had seen every variety of medical visitor and categorized them all without judgment, came by at 14:40 to check the monitors. He noted Sira's presence with a professional nod and then noticed with slightly more attention the configuration of Eli's hand, which had, at some point in the 12 minutes since she had sat down, found hers. Not abruptly. Gradually, the way water finds a level, his fingers had migrated across the bed surface and curled around hers with a purposeful, sleeping certainty that suggested his unconscious body had made a decision his waking mind had been too circumspect to reach. Pell looked at this. He looked at Sira. "It's a known behavior in human sedation recovery," he said, with the tone of a man filing this under existing knowledge rather than new development. "Involuntary. They sometimes reach for tactile anchors during the come-up period. It's neurological." He paused, reviewing the monitors. Best not to disturb him. It can spike the heart rate. He moved on to the next bay with the seamless professionalism of someone who had absolutely noticed the bioluminescent warmth climbing Sira's temples and had chosen, with great deliberateness, not to comment on it. She looked at her hand. She looked at his. His grip was not aggressive. It was quiet and thorough, the grip of something that had decided and was done deciding, her fingers enclosed in his with the gentle insistence of a conviction held during sleep, which is the most honest kind. She did not pull away. She told herself this was because pulling away would spike his heart rate, which Pell had just confirmed, and she was a medical professional and the recommendation was clear. She told herself this for a while. The ward continued its quiet business around her. Staff moved through the corridor beyond the door. The secondary star of the Venn system held its position in the window with the patience of something that had been burning for 4 billion years and could wait. An hour passed. The bioluminescent lines along her hands had settled into a color she was not going to translate, even to herself, because naming a thing and sitting quietly with a thing are different activities with different consequences, and she was not ready for the first one. She was, however, apparently willing to do the second one for another 2 hours, which told her something she was also not translating. He woke at 17:03, not suddenly. In pieces, the way the procedure's notes had predicted, awareness arriving before language, sensation before recognition, the slow boot sequence of a consciousness coming back online after pharmaceutical override. His eyes opened and found the ceiling, and the ceiling meant nothing to them yet. Then they found the window, and the light, and the shape of the room, and then they found her face, and something in them shifted into a register that was not yet coherent but was already unmistakably personal. She laughed. She had not prepared to laugh. It arrived without consultation. A real, startled, embarrassed sound, not the polished social expression she deployed in professional contexts, but something underneath that, involuntary and unguarded, mixing amusement and the specific helplessness of a person caught doing something they cannot explain at short notice. Her skin moved through rose and amber in a display that required no translation guide and was, in the recovery ward's ambient lighting, considerably visible. "You have been holding my hand," she said, with remarkable composure, "for 3 hours." He looked down. His hand was wrapped around hers with the devoted certainty of someone who had made up his mind and committed completely. The grip, unhurried and total in the way that only sleeping people and very decided people manage. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man reading a message he does not remember sending. "The nurses said not to wake you," she continued, because the silence was the kind that needed navigating. Humans sometimes reach for things during sedation recovery. It is neurological. She said this with precise accuracy and a steadiness that her bioluminescent traceries were making a sincere effort to undermine. But I thought perhaps you should know. He looked up at her. His brain was still negotiating its chemistry. His grip did not loosen. The full cognitive function returned to Eli Voss in the way that administrative approvals arrive on Helix Varda, gradually, in stages, with each stage less satisfying than anticipated, and the final result still somehow surprising. By 17, 20 he could form sentences. By 17, 35 he could form sentences that reflected what he actually meant, which is a separate skill and one that takes longer to come back online after pharmaceutical intervention. By 17, 40 he was sitting up in the recovery bed with a cup of water that Sira had retrieved from the ward dispenser, and his left shoulder felt better than it had in 3 years. And his right hand felt the specific absence of something it had apparently decided was load-bearing. And Sira was sitting in the chair beside him, with the careful composure of someone who had prepared several versions of what they were about to say, and was now selecting between them in real time. She told him about the cultural weight of hand-holding among the Vaethari, with the measured, clinical precision of a researcher presenting findings she would have preferred to find differently. Sustained voluntary physical contact of the hand, she explained. Intimate gesture, reserved in Vaethari's social protocol for bonded pairs or the formal declaration of intent to become one. She said semi-public setting. She said 3 hours of continuous contact. She said rotating staff, as in multiple witnesses across multiple shift intervals, which in Vaethari's social taxonomy constituted not a private moment but a statement made to an audience. She said all of this with her hands folded in her lap and the bioluminescent traceries along her temples doing a sustained and earnest impression of a disclosure document she had not authorized. Eli listened to this. He took a measured sip of his water. He said, "Is there paperwork?" She looked at him. The amber ring in her eyes did something specific. "No," she said, "there is not paperwork." "For the declaration," he said, "I want to make sure I understand the process." "There is a cultural protocol," she said. With the restraint of someone choosing not to laugh for professional reasons, she was currently revising the importance of. "It is not bureaucratic. So no forms to file," he said. "No carbon copies, nothing for my personnel record." "Eli, I'm asking because my personnel record already has a note about the supply crate incident on level 2, and I'm trying to assess whether this is the kind of thing that appears beside it or in a separate section." She did laugh then, briefly, and against what appeared to be her better judgment. The bioluminescence at her collarbones flaring a warm and immediate gold before she assembled her expression back into something more professionally defensible. He watched this happen and filed it, carefully, in the part of his brain that was now fully online and making up for lost time. She explained the rest of it with patience. The declaration, as it stood, was non-binding. His unconscious state was a known variable. The nurses had documented it as involuntary, and Vaethari protocol included provisions for the distinction between deliberate and incidental contact. He was not, she clarified, officially in a relationship by virtue of having been asleep. She said this last part with a very precise neutrality that he was now cognitively equipped to notice, and he noticed it, and he did not say anything about noticing it, because he had been awake for 40 minutes and was pacing himself. What he was not able to avoid, leaving the medical wing 2 hours later with his shoulder, immobilized in a regenerative brace, and a printed aftercare sheet, that the nurse had handed him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handed out many aftercare sheets and was thinking about dinner, was the knowledge that the ward had not been empty during those 3 hours. Helix Varda was a station of 412 people. Its corridors were staffed continuously. The recovery ward was on a main through route. The mathematics of this were not complicated, and by the time Eli reached the equipment corridor on level 4 and stood in front of the panel that concealed the good coffee dispenser, he had already done them. Dren found him there, which was not accidental. Dren, who was haughty and compact and possessed of the diplomatic sensitivity of a structural integrity report, had a gift for locating people at exactly the moment they would prefer not to be located, and he exercised this gift with the cheerful consistency of someone who did not recognize it as imposition. He poured himself a coffee. He looked at Eli's brace. He said, "The shoulder is done, then." Eli confirmed this. Dren nodded. He said, "The ward staff have been very professional about the other thing." He said it the way people say something when they mean the opposite of professional, with the intonation of someone reading a sentence they find technically accurate and personally delightful. Eli asked what specifically had been said. Dren told him that the current station consensus was divided between two interpretations, one that found the situation accidentally romantic, and one that attributed it entirely to documented human neurological behavior under sedation, and that both camps appeared satisfied and were not expected to reach a unified position, as the ambiguity was most of the entertainment value. Eli asked, with the weariness of a man recalibrating his expectations for the next several weeks, whether there was any realistic possibility of the station simply forgetting about it. Dren considered this with the theatrical seriousness of a haughty considering a question they have already answered internally. He said something in his own language that the translation implant rendered as, "On a station with 400 people and a ventilation system that hums the same note every day, there is very little competition for the available attention." And then he finished his coffee, replaced his cup, and left with the tranquility of a man who was not currently the subject of consensus opinion, and appreciated this fact without mentioning it. The following days had the quality of a frequency everyone could hear and no one was acknowledging. Eli went back to his shift rotation. His shoulder healed on the schedule the aftercare sheet predicted. He ran his cross-species recovery protocols. He adjusted the cold reading panels on the second-generation med frames as he always had. He ate lunch on Tuesday and Thursday and Wednesday in the cafeteria, and Sierra was there on 2 of those 3 days, which was normal, which was the same as it had always been. And they talked about the inflammatory response study and a new xenobiology intake from the outer research clusters, and a minor structural complaint Sierra had filed about the ventilation in her wing, which she said had developed a secondary harmonic that she suspected correlated with reduced concentration scores in the weekly performance metrics, and which Eli said sounded like a reasonable hypothesis, and also like the kind of complaint that would take 6 months to be assigned to a maintenance queue. She agreed. They drank coffee that was not the good coffee because neither of them had mentioned the level 4 panel in 3 days, which was not something either of them was examining. What he noticed and could not stop noticing was the bioluminescence. He had read the papers. He knew the color ranges. He knew that the warm amber that appeared at her temples when she was listening to him described something. Not when she was being polite, not when she was performing collegial interest, but when she had actually caught on something he'd said and was pulling it toward her, corresponded to a state the literature described with the Vaethari word that translated loosely as genuine engagement, the kind that is not decided but arrived. He knew that the soft gold that had flared at her collarbones when she laughed in the recovery ward sat, in the taxonomical spectrum, very close to the word for pleasure that is also the word for recognition. The feeling of something being as good as you had, without fully admitting it, expected it to be. He knew all of this because he had read the papers at 11 o'clock at night for reasons he had not examined, and was not examining now, standing in the corridor outside the cafeteria after Wednesday's lunch, watching her walk back toward The xenobiology wing with the even, unhurried stride of someone who did not know they were being watched. The traceries along her hands cycling through a color he did not have a word for yet, in any language, and was beginning to think he would need one. It was Dren who finally said it, on a Tuesday, with the directness of a species that had evolved without the social architecture humans use to soften things they mean entirely. He said it over breakfast in the cafeteria, between a forkful of something the menu described as a protein composite with cultivated grain base, and what the rest of the station called Tuesday's gray situation. He said, "There is a response window." Eli looked up from his coffee. Dren continued. He said that in Vaethari cultural protocol, a hand-holding declaration, voluntary or otherwise, carried a formal response period during which the receiving party could either acknowledge the gesture or allow it to dissolve into the category of incidents that were unintentional and therefore non-binding. He said that this window was not infinite. He said that he had looked this up, which he delivered without embarrassment, because Dren had never experienced embarrassment about research and was not about to start. He said that the window, according to the third edition of the cross-species social protocol reference that the station kept in its cultural affairs database, and that apparently no one read except Dren, and it now emerged, Eli at 11 o'clock at night, was 30 standard days. He said that Eli was currently on day 19. Then he ate his protein composite with the serenity of a man who had delivered a report and considered his professional obligations discharged. Eli sat with this for a moment. He said, "You looked it up." "Someone had to," Dren said. "And you're telling me now, on day 19. Dren considered the ceiling with the expression of a HFY-performing reflection. "I told you on the correct day," he said. "Earlier would have been premature. You needed 11 days to stop pretending the cafeteria was a normal place to be." Eli did not have an answer to this that improved his position, so he said nothing, which Dren accepted as the concession it was. He finished his coffee. He looked at the table. He thought about the papers he had read and the window seat he had saved, and the level 4 panel and the gold at her collarbones when she laughed, and the color moving through her hands on Wednesday afternoon in the corridor, the one he didn't have a word for yet. He thought about 19 days of eating lunch in a cafeteria that served food, a civilization capable of folding space had genuinely allowed to happen, telling himself this was normal and that nothing had changed, and that his unconscious self's decisions were not legally his problem. He thought about all the energy he had spent not examining things that were, in retrospect, extremely examined. He called his sister that evening from his quarters, which required booking a communication slot through the station's deep range relay and accepting an 11-minute signal delay each direction, a fact of interstellar life that everyone on the station had accommodated and no one had fully made their peace with. He explained the situation. He explained it with more detail than he intended, which told him something about how long it had been sitting in a pressurized container waiting for a release valve. His sister listened. He could tell she was listening because the 11-minute gap before her response, when it arrived, contained no indication that she had spent the time doing anything other than sitting with what he had said. She said, with the flat, warm certainty of someone who had known him since before he knew himself, "You called me across 11 light minutes to tell me that a woman sat beside your hospital bed for 3 hours holding your hand, and you're worried about whether it counts." A pause that was only the signal delay. "Eli, go find her." The transmission ended. He sat in his quarters for a while with the specific feeling of a man who has received an answer he already had and simply needed confirmed by someone who would not let him argue with it. He found her in the xenobiology wing at 20:40 station time, when the lighting had shifted to the lower, warmer register that Helix Varda used to approximate evening, a small daily fiction the station maintained with the dedication of something that understood that humans and several other species needed the light to change in order to believe time was passing. The corridors were quiet. The wing was mostly empty at this hour. She was at her workstation, a screen full of inflammatory response data casting a pale light across her face, and the bioluminescent traceries along her temples were the steady, concentrated blue-green of deep focus, which he now knew meant she was not thinking about him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with that knowledge, just holding it, before he stepped inside. He pulled a chair from the neighboring empty station, which required slightly more maneuvering than the moment strictly called for, the chair having decided to catch on the desk leg in a way that was audible and graceless. And Sira turned at the sound with an expression that had not yet composed itself for an audience. The bioluminescence shifted before she had made a single decision about her face. A bloom of amber moving from her collarbone upward, immediate and complete, the kind of thing that cannot be argued with because it does not go through language first. He sat down, he looked at her, he said, "I looked up the response window." She said nothing. The amber held, he said. "Dren also looked up the response window independently and told me this morning, which I want you to know I found both helpful and slightly invasive, and I am choosing to focus on the helpful." Something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, waiting to see where this was going before it committed. He said, "I want to be clear that I have no memory of the original declaration. My unconscious self made a unilateral decision without consulting me and executed it over a period of 3 hours in a semi-public medical ward, which is frankly an overstep." He said, however. He paused. The ventilation hummed its note. Somewhere in the station's infrastructure, a system cycled through its routine, the vast and ordinary machinery of a place that kept people alive in the void between stars, going about its work with the indifference of something that did not know it was the backdrop for anything. "I have been saving the window seat since before I knew I was saving it," he said. "I have read 2 papers on bioluminescent emotional display markers at 11 o'clock at night for no professional reason. I showed you the level 4 panel because your expression with the cafeteria coffee was the most accurate thing I had seen in 2 years on this station." He said, "I would like my unconscious self's decision to be my decision, with the caveat that my unconscious self has better instincts than I have been giving it credit for, and I intend to have a longer conversation with it about communication strategy." He slid his hand across the workstation surface toward hers, not quite reaching, leaving the last distance hers to close or not. He said, "I would like, with complete wakefulness and full cognitive function and no sedation of any kind currently in my bloodstream, to hold your hand again. On purpose this time." The bioluminescence moved through 3 colors in the space of a breath. He had read about this, the rapid sequential display indicating a state that the academic literature, handled with the careful honesty of researchers admitting the limits of translation, describing it as the overlap between relief and recognition, and something that does not reduce to a single word in any language he had access to. She looked at him for a moment that had the quality of a long exhale. Then she reached across the workstation and took his hand, and her grip was nothing like the blind, sedated certainty he apparently had when unconscious. It was deliberate and quiet and awake, a choice made with full information, which made it different in every way that a thing can be different while still being the same fundamental shape. She said, "For the record, I had only planned to stay a few minutes." He said, "I know." She said, "The nurse told me it was neurological." He said, "It probably was." He paused. "I also saved you the window seat 53 times. That one's harder to attribute to neurology." The gold came back to her collarbones then, the same gold as in the recovery ward, the one that sat close to the word for pleasure that is also the word for recognition. She did not pull her hand back. The station held its orbit with the patience of something that had been doing this for a long time and intended to continue. The ventilation hummed. The lights stayed warm. Outside the window of the xenobiology wing, the secondary star of the Venn system held its ancient, indifferent light across the dark, and Eli Voss sat in a chair he had dragged slightly ungracefully from a neighboring desk, in a station that appeared on no one's list of dream postings, holding the hand of someone whose name he had read in academic papers he had pretended not to read, and felt, with a clarity that required no translation, that the thing he had not been examining had been worth every careful, patient, unhurried day of not examining it, because it had arrived at this, and this, it turned out, was exactly what he had been orbiting all along.